Imagine being alone in the sky, with every manual telling you that you're about to die. That's exactly what happened when pilot Philip Adair suffered critical damage to the controls of his P-40 and chose not to bail out. That morning, 64 Japanese aircraft were advancing to destroy an entire base, and Adair was the only one standing between them and total devastation. His Warhawk, Lulu Belle, had already taken 16 hits. The right aileron was jammed, and the aircraft was plunging into a dive that any instructor would call suicide. But instead of abandoning the cockpit, Adair did something no one had ever attempted before. And here's where the story becomes even more unbelievable. Flying with broken controls, he discovered a way to maneuver that contradicted everything he had been taught. A technique never documented, never repeated, and one that saved the entire Dinjan airfield, 14 seconds, and the Himalayan airlift. Before I tell you this story, I ask that you subscribe to the channel and leave your like so we can hit our goal of 1,000 likes on this video. Comment where you're watching from, and whether you or someone in your family has ever served in the armed forces. Now yes, let's get to what really matters. December 3, 1943, 0642, Dinjan Aerodrome, Assam, British India. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was alone in the sky when the sun was still struggling to break through the thick fog covering the Naga Hills to the east. His P-40 Newton's Warhawk, affectionately christened Lulu Belle, cut through the cold morning air at 4,200 meters altitude, patrolling in slow circles over the airstrip that maintained the lifeline of Allied forces in the China-Burma-India theater. Below him, 14 C-47 Skytrain transports waited on the runway, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel destined for Chinese forces fighting against the Japanese invasion. Those aircraft represented the only viable route to cross the Himalayas, the most dangerous airlift of the war, known to pilots as the hump. Without warning, the voice of the ground controller exploded on the radio with enough urgency to make Adair's stomach contract. Bandits to the east, massive formation, estimate 60 plus. All pilots scramble immediately. Adair jerked his head sharply to the right and saw them, first as dark dots against the illuminated horizon, then as a cloud of metallic insects approaching in disciplined formation. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, their characteristic silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance, escorted by 40 Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar fighters dancing around the bombers like wasps protecting their hive. 64 Japanese aircraft, a complete air army, and only him in the sky. The radio crackled again. Scramble canceled. Scramble canceled. Insufficient time for takeoff. The controller's voice trembled. Adair understood instantly. If those C-47 seconds were destroyed on the ground, the Allied offensive in northern Burma would collapse. Thousands of Chinese soldiers would be left without supplies. The airlift would be severed. He didn't wait for orders. He pushed the throttle all the way forward, feeling the 1,360 horses of the Allison V-1710 engine roar in response, and dove toward the Japanese formation like a hawk falling upon a cloud of crows. The math was absurd. 1 against 64. The odds were so bad they didn't even deserve to be calculated. But Adair wasn't thinking about math. He was thinking about the men sleeping in the barracks below, about the C-47 crews desperately running for anti-aircraft shelters, about the tons of bombs that would fall on the aerodrome in a matter of minutes. He had to break that formation, had to make them hesitate, divert, anything to buy time for the ground defenders. At 800 meters from the bombers, Adair aligned the Warhawk's nose with the lead Sally and pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns exploded simultaneously, tracing lines of tracer fire across the morning sky. Projectiles pierced the bomber's left wing, tearing off pieces of metal that spun backward in the airstream. The lead Sally staggered. Black smoke poured from its engine, but the formation held firm. Then the Oscars reacted. 10, 15, 20 Japanese fighters broke formation and turned toward Adair like sharks detecting blood in the water. He yanked the stick violently to the left, feeling the G-force compress his body against the seat as the P-40 entered a tight turn that made his vision darken at the edges. 12.7 millimeters projectiles passed where he had been a second before, tearing through the air with sharp, deadly sounds. Adair rolled the Warhawk upside down and dove, gaining speed while the Earth spun unnaturally above him. At 500 kilometers per hour, he pulled the stick again and climbed in an Immelman turn, emerging behind 3 Oscars still searching for him at the previous altitude. Another burst. One Oscar released smoke and broke formation, its pilot fighting controls that no longer responded. But there were too many of them. Far too many. Adair felt the impacts before he heard them. Thunk, 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 thunk. 4 Japanese projectiles passed through the P-40's tail. Then 6 pierced the right wing. Then 6 more hit the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The Warhawk shuddered like a wounded animal. Warning lights lit up on the panel. Oil temperature rising. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Adair tried to roll right, and the stick locked. Completely locked. He pulled with full force, arm muscles burning, but it was like trying to bend solid steel. The right aileron was stuck in neutral position, probably with control cables severed by shrapnel. Worse still, when he pushed the stick forward to test, the P-40's nose dove violently downward with much more force than it should. Something in the elevator system was also damaged, making the aircraft dangerously unstable in pitch. Altitude, 600 meters, and dropping rapidly. The voice of training echoed in his mind, clear as a bell. Damaged controls mean immediate aircraft abandonment. There's no heroism in dying from pride. At Luke Field, Arizona, where Adair had learned to fly the P-40, the instructors repeated this like a mantra. Damaged aircraft were unpredictable, deadly, impossible to control. Bailing out was the only acceptable protocol. Adair looked down. Dense jungle covered everything between him and the aerodrome. If he bailed now, it would take days to cross that green labyrinth, days that Dinjan aerodrome didn't have. And more importantly, the Japanese were still up there, still flying toward the defenseless C-47 seconds. His attack had broken the formation temporarily, but hadn't stopped them. They would regroup in minutes. Adair made a decision that contradicted every self-preservation instinct he possessed. He would stay with the aircraft. Somehow, some way, he would bring it back. But first he needed to understand what exactly was broken and how to compensate. The basic physics of aviation is simple in theory. Ailerons control roll, elevators control pitch, rudder controls yaw. When one of these systems fails, the aircraft becomes a partially uncontrollable object flying at hundreds of kilometers per hour. What Adair understood in that moment, while fighting against the locked stick and feeling the P-40's nose wanting to constantly dive, was something no training manual taught. Damaged aircraft don't behave according to the rules. They create their own rules, and you have seconds to figure out what they are. The P-40 was diving at 45 degrees, gaining deadly speed toward the treetops that were rapidly approaching. Adair pulled the stick with full force, using both hands, feeling the muscles in his arms and shoulders scream with the effort. The nose rose slightly, but not enough, and the aircraft began to vibrate threateningly as speed increased beyond safe limits. The Warhawk's structure groaned under the stress. Someone else would have panicked. Someone else would have pulled the emergency canopy and bailed at that exact second, preferring the uncertainty of the jungle to the certainty of splattering against the ground at 700 kilometers per hour. But Adair wasn't just fighting the aircraft. He was listening to it, feeling it, learning its new language. He noticed that when he applied firm and constant pressure on the stick, instead of abrupt pulls, the damaged elevator responded more predictably. He noticed the engine was still producing full power, which meant he had a critical tool available: power control as a partial substitute for pitch control. More power would lift the nose through thrust. Less power would let it drop. It was a delicate technique, normally used only for fine adjustments, but now it was all he had. Adair reduced power by a third and felt the nose yield slightly, then increased again, observing how the angle of attack changed. It was like flying through a defective translator, where every command had to be reinterpreted and adjusted in real time. The aircraft leveled at only 150 meters altitude, so low that Adair could see individual leaves on the treetops. He had bought himself a few precious seconds to think. The next problem was navigation. With the right aileron locked, he couldn't make normal coordinated turns. Every time he tried to roll using only the left aileron and rudder, the P-40 entered an uncontrolled lateral slide that threatened to turn into a deadly spin. So Adair did something his instructors would have called madness. He began using only the rudder to make shallow turns, keeping the wings level and allowing the aircraft to slip laterally through the air in uncoordinated maneuvers that made the airspeed indicator oscillate violently. It was inefficient, wasted energy and speed, but it worked. He was flying, barely flying, flying in an ugly and asymmetric way, but flying. Now came the impossible part, finding a place to land. Dinjan Aerodrome was 69 kilometers to the southwest, through mountains and valleys covered by impenetrable jungle. There were no emergency fields, no roads wide enough, just trees as far as the eye could see. Any forced landing in the jungle would be fatal. But there was another option, one that made so little sense that Adair almost immediately dismissed it. Nagaguli, a tiny auxiliary airfield, hastily built a few months earlier, used mainly for emergency refueling. The runway was less than 800 meters long, surrounded by hills on both sides, with an approach considered technically possible, but tactically idiotic, even by the most experienced pilots. Landing a functional P-40 at Nagaguli required surgical precision. Landing a P-40 with destroyed controls was literally impossible. No one had ever tried. No one would be crazy enough to try. Adair turned southwest using his rudder-only technique, feeling the P-40 skid through the air like a car taking turns on an icy road. Every stick adjustment required total concentration. Too much input, and the nose dove. Too little input, and the aircraft stalled. He had to maintain constant and perfect pressure, adjusting engine power in sync, like playing a destroyed musical instrument, and still trying to extract melody from it. The Naga Mountains passed below, their peaks covered in morning fog. Adair kept altitude low, 300 meters above terrain, because he didn't trust his ability to regain altitude if he lost lift. The P-40's engine continued running smoothly, a miracle considering at least 2 projectiles had pierced the cowling. Oil temperature still rising, but still within marginally acceptable limits. Estimated time to complete engine failure, maybe 20 minutes. Time to Nagaguli, 18 minutes, if he maintained current speed. It was possible, theoretically. After 15 minutes of flight that felt like hours, Adair saw Nagaguli emerge from between 2 green hills. The runway was even smaller than he remembered, a red scar of packed earth that seemed completely inadequate to receive any aircraft, much less one that could barely fly. He had to get it right on the first attempt. There wasn't enough power or control to go around. It was land or die. Adair began his approach at 600 meters distance, reducing power gradually and feeling the P-40 begin to descend. The nose wanted to drop too fast, so he added a touch of power, then another, making micro-adjustments every second. Speed dropped to 180 kilometers per hour, then 170, then 160. Too slow and the Warhawk would stall and fall like a stone. Too fast and he would overshoot the runway before he could brake. The aircraft was vibrating constantly now, damaged fuselage, creating asymmetric drag that tried to turn the nose left. Adair compensated with constant pressure on the right rudder, right leg beginning to tremble with the effort. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold at altitude. His hands gripped the stick so tightly his knuckles were white. The runway approached. 400 meters. 300 meters. Adair could see figures running on the ground. Ground crews who had heard the damaged engine and come out to observe. Some pointed rifles upward, unsure if it was friend or foe. The P-40 was so misaligned, flying so strangely, that it looked like an enemy aircraft being piloted by someone who didn't know how to control it properly. 200 meters. The landing gear. Adair had to lower the landing gear. He actuated the hydraulic lever, and nothing happened. The green, gear-locked light didn't come on. The hydraulic system was dead, probably destroyed by the same projectiles that had severed the control cables. He would have to use the manual emergency system, a pump that required 40 vigorous actuations to lower the wheels mechanically. 40 actuations while flying a nearly uncontrollable aircraft at 150 kilometers per hour at 100 meters altitude. Adair released his left hand from the stick and grabbed the manual pump beside the seat. He began pumping frantically, keeping his right hand on the stick and his eyes alternating between the approaching runway and the landing gear position indicator. Pump. Look forward. Pump. Adjust power with the right. Pump. The nose drops a bit. Add power. Pump. 20, 25, 30. The green light blinked. The gear was descending. 35, 40. The light stayed solid. Gear locked. 100 meters from the runway. Altitude 50 meters. Speed 155 kilometers per hour. Adair cut power and felt the P-40 sink faster. The ground rose to meet him. He pulled the stick gently, trying to round out the descent, but the damaged elevator responded too late. The wheels hit the red earth with a brutal impact that made his teeth chatter and the aircraft's structure groan in protest. The P-40 bounced, wheels leaving the ground again for one terrible second, then hit again even harder. Adair stepped on the brakes. Nothing. Dead hydraulic system meant no brakes. The aircraft was rolling at 120 kilometers per hour on an 800-meter runway, and he had no way to stop. The end of the runway approached rapidly. Beyond it, a 5-meter embankment dropping to a field of stones. Adair did the only thing left. He shut off the ignition, cutting the engine completely, and turned the stick fully left while stepping with full force on the right rudder. The P-40, powerless and with maximum drag from crossed controls, began to skid violently to the right, landing gear screaming against the ground. The maneuver bled speed through pure friction and air resistance. 90 kilometers per hour. 70, 50. The aircraft spun 180 degrees on its own axis, raising a cloud of red dust that obscured everything. When the dust settled, the P-40 was stopped less than 10 meters from the embankment, pointing back toward the beginning of the runway, completely motionless. Adair remained seated for a long moment, hands still gripping the stick, unable to release it immediately. His arms trembled with adrenaline discharge. He could hear his own heart beating like a hammer against his ribs. Slowly, he forced his fingers to open and release the controls. He looked at his hands and saw that his palms were marked red, where his nails had pressed into the flesh. He slid the canopy back, and the hot Indian air flooded the cockpit, carrying the smell of red earth and burned oil smoke. He tried to stand and discovered his legs barely responded. He had maintained full tension in his muscles during the entire flight, and now they refused to cooperate properly. He had to lean on the side of the fuselage to climb down, moving like a man 3 times older. As soon as his feet touched the ground crews came running, circling the damaged aircraft with expressions of absolute shock. A mechanic sergeant, a burly man named Morrison, whom Adair recognized from the maintenance hangar at Dinjan, walked slowly around the P-40, looking at the bullet holes as if he were seeing a ghost. 16 visible impacts piercing wings, fuselage, and tail. Control cables hanging from the bottom of the right wing like exposed tendons. The right aileron completely locked in an unnatural position. An entire section of the left elevator missing, probably torn off by a 20mm explosive projectile. "Lieutenant," Morrison finally said, voice hoarse with disbelief, "how the hell did you fly this back?" Adair didn't have an adequate answer. He himself wasn't sure. "Didn't make right turns," he said, and it sounded absurd, even as the words left his mouth. Morrison let out a short, humorless laugh. "Didn't make right turns. Sir, you flew 69 kilometers with destroyed controls using only rudder and power adjustments, something no manual says is possible, and landed without brakes at Nagahuli, which half the pilots on base are afraid to attempt with a functional aircraft." He shook his head. This shouldn't be possible. Physically, it shouldn't be possible. But it had been possible, because Adair had done something that wasn't in the training manuals. He had stopped treating the P-40 as a functional aircraft and started treating it as a real-time physics problem. Every control input was an experiment. Every aircraft response was data. He had built a new mental model of how that specific machine, in that specific state of damage, would behave, and had adjusted his flying accordingly, second by second, until the final landing. It was intuitive aerodynamics under impossible conditions. A major appeared among the ground crews, immaculate uniform contrasting with the dirt and disorder around him. "Lieutenant Adair," he said, voice carrying military authority but also something like admiration. "I'm Major Henshaw, commander of this installation. I need your report on what happened up there." Adair straightened, ignoring the pain in his muscles. "Sir, intercepted enemy formation of approximately 64 aircraft over Dinjan at 6:47. Engaged to break attack on aerodrome. Received multiple combat damage resulting in partial control failure. Executed emergency landing here per protocol." It was the standard military report, dry and factual, which completely omitted the part where he had defied all known rules of aviation. Henshaw studied his face for a long moment. "Protocol?" he repeated, and there was the slightest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Lieutenant, what exactly is the protocol for flying an uncontrollable aircraft for 70 kilometers through mountains?" "Adapt to the situation, sir," Adair responded, and realized it was the most honest answer he could give. Henshaw nodded slowly. "Your actions over Dinjan interrupted the Japanese attack long enough for anti-aircraft defenses to be activated. 2 Sally bombers were shot down by ground artillery. 5 others returned damaged. No, C-47 seconds were lost. The airlift remains operational." He paused. "You saved that aerodrome, Lieutenant. Saved those transports. Saved the entire operation." The word should have sounded like a victory, but Adair just felt tremendously tired. He looked at the wrecked P-40, at the bullet holes that had come so close to hitting him directly, at the hanging control cables that should have made flight impossible. "Lulu Belle saved the aerodrome, sir," he said quietly. "I just tried to keep her in the air." This wasn't false modesty. It was acknowledgement of a truth Adair had learned that morning. The line between pilot and machine wasn't as clear as training manuals suggested. When you pushed an aircraft beyond its designed limits, when you flew in territory where normal rules no longer applied, pilot and machine had to become one thing, each compensating for the other's failures in real time. In the following weeks, Adair's flight became something like a whispered legend among pilots of the China-Burma-India theater. Men who had flown hundreds of combat missions heard the story and shook their heads in disbelief. Flight instructors debated heatedly whether what he had done was brilliance or just impossible luck. No definitive conclusion was reached, because the technique Adair had used was fundamentally unteachable. You couldn't write a manual about how to fly with broken controls, because each set of damage created a different set of problems, each requiring unique improvised solutions. What Adair had demonstrated wasn't a replicable technique, but a principle. That exceptional pilots don't follow procedures blindly, but understand the underlying principles well enough to invent new procedures when the old ones fail. This deep understanding of aerodynamics, not just as a theoretical concept but as a physical reality felt through the controls, was what separated pilots who survived from pilots who became statistics. Adair himself never wrote about the experience in technical terms. There was no lessons learned report filed, no technical bulletin distributed to other units. Partly because the improvised nature of what he had done resisted formal documentation, but also because he recognized that the next person facing damaged controls would face a different set of problems requiring different solutions. What he could teach wasn't how to land with a locked aileron, but how to listen to what your aircraft is saying when all the normal rules have stopped working. Philip Adair continued flying combat missions through 1,944 and into 1,945. He flew 139 combat missions in total, accumulated 5 confirmed aerial victories achieving A status, survived 3 other emergency landings with combat damage, and witnessed the end of the war from the cockpit of fighters over Burma and China. Every time he climbed into a P-40, he checked the controls with extra attention, moving the stick through its full range, feeling the response, memorizing how that specific aircraft behaved when everything was working correctly. Because now he knew, one day, you might need to feel the difference when things stop working. After the war, Adair remained in the Air Force through the reorganization that created the United States Air Force as a separate branch in 1947. He flew jets in Korea, commanded squadrons, trained young pilots, ascended through the ranks with the steady progression of someone who was respected but never sought the spotlight. When young pilots occasionally asked about that flight in December 1943, about how he had landed an uncontrollable aircraft, Adair generally deflected the question or changed the subject. Not out of modesty, but because he recognized that narratives of heroism often lost the nuances that really mattered. It wasn't about courage, it was about understanding. It wasn't about defying death, it was about respecting physics. He retired as a colonel in 1971, after 28 years of service, most of it spent in cockpits of aircraft ranging from World War II piston fighters to supersonic jets of the Cold War era. At his retirement ceremony, someone mentioned that impossible flight over Assam, and Adair finally offered his most complete reflection on the subject. "It wasn't impossible," he said, speaking to a room full of aviators who had heard the story countless times but never the definitive explanation. "It was just undocumented. There's a difference. Impossible means the laws of physics don't allow it. Undocumented means just that no one had figured out how yet. That morning I had to figure out how. The aircraft gave me the clues. I just paid attention." It was a typically modest answer that still left the audience wondering exactly what he had done, but it contained a truth that Adair had taken decades to fully articulate, that excellence in extreme situations comes not from following rules, but from understanding the principles behind the rules deeply enough to know when and how to break them. The 16 bullet holes in P-40 Newton's Lulu Belle remained unrepaired for several weeks after Adair's flight, the aircraft sitting at Nagahuli as a kind of unofficial exhibit that pilots visited to see and touch, trying to imagine how anyone had flown that back. Eventually, it was transported back to Dinjan, where maintenance crews spent more than a month rebuilding control systems, replacing entire sections of fuselage, restoring it to flight condition. Adair flew it again in February 1944 on an escort mission over Burma and reported that it flew perfectly now, almost disappointingly normal. Lulu Belle survived the war, was eventually sent back to the United States and scrapped at some salvage depot in 1946, the fate of thousands of combat aircraft that became obsolete with the arrival of the jet age. No plaque marked where it had been destroyed. No museum preserved its wreckage. The physical aircraft disappeared into history, but the flight remained. The story of Philip Adair and his impossible flight over Assam became one of those narratives that aviators tell to illustrate a point about flying that resists direct explanation. It's invoked in discussions about pilot judgment, about the difference between knowing procedures and understanding principles, about the kind of thinking that keeps you alive when every backup system has failed and you're alone with a broken machine and seconds to figure out what to do next. The most remarkable thing about the flight, in retrospect, isn't that Adair survived, though that was remarkable enough. It's that he saved something by surviving. 14 C-47 transports that would have been destroyed continued flying the hump, carrying supplies that kept Chinese forces on the battlefield. The airlift that Adair had protected delivered more than 650,000 tons of supplies until the end of the war, sustaining operations that finally expelled Japanese forces from Burma and reopened land routes to China. Thousands of lives depended on that supply line, and that supply line had remained intact because one pilot had refused to accept that damaged controls meant inevitable defeat. He had listened to what the aircraft was saying, had understood the physics of what was happening, and had found a solution that no manual contained, because no manual could contain all possible solutions to all possible problems. That's the final lesson of Philip Adair's flight, that true competence in any field requires not just knowing the rules, but understanding the underlying reality deeply enough to function when the rules no longer apply. Whether flying damaged aircraft, solving impossible engineering problems, or navigating any situation where standard procedures have failed and you're alone with a problem and the urgent need for a solution, the principle remains the same. Listen to what the system is saying. Understand the fundamentals. Adapt to what is, not to what should be. And sometimes, if you have skill and understanding, and maybe a bit of luck, you'll discover that the impossible was just the not yet attempted. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a like and comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far our content is reaching. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can access incredible stories for free. A big hug, and see you in the next video.